Hello and welcome to another GrainTALK webinar series. Today we have Mike Cowbrough with us to talk about the 2020 Weed Control Checklist. Mike, I'll let you do a little bit of introduction about yourself and we'll hop right into it.
Sure, thanks a lot. I'm the weed specialist in field crops for the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, a position I've had since 2002. And today I'm just going to give you a 4-point checklist of things to consider for the 2020 growing season. So we'll begin by looking at that to-do list. Our first point is building soil fertility. That has a lot of significant impacts around weed management. So we'll touch base on that. We'll aim to have the crop emerge before any weeds do this coming season. We'll want to control weeds that are less than 10 centimeters tall. We know that small weeds are easier to kill than big weeds. That sounds easier said than done though. So we're going to go through some tweaks in management we can do to ensure that we're hitting things when they're small and not large. And then lastly, if all our best laid plans fail, are there ways that we can quickly test for weed identification or even herbicide resistance so that we can adapt and address those issues with management? So let's begin with the first on our to-do list, which is build soil fertility. So I want to draw on some work that was done with myself and Dr. Francois Tardif at the University of Guelph. And so on the screen here, you see a picture of soybean expressing potassium deficiency symptoms, right? That yellowing of the leaf margins. And in some of our research plots where we were looking at different weed management programs, we had also in there different levels of soil fertility. So there was a series of plots with very low levels of soil potassium, 60 parts per million, around that level, so pretty low. And when we compared the weed management in those plots versus plots that had sufficient fertility, there is a significant difference in weed control. And one of the main reasons for that is that when we have soils that are low in potash, we have a tough time getting canopies to close quickly. So on this figure that you see on your screen here, this is just tracking the amount of light that's hitting the ground under soybeans that have adequate levels of soil fertility, in this case potassium or potash, versus soybean plants growing in a deficient soil. So on the left-hand side of that figure is a scale of sunlight. So basically at 1, the ground is fully open, sun is getting direct coverage on the soil. So that's kind of analogous to after planting. 0, by contrast, is at full canopy closure. So no sunlight is hitting the soil. And in this figure here, the blue line is soybeans growing with adequate fertility, in this case, potassium. And that's being compared to the red line, which is soybeans growing in soils with a deficiency issue. And you can see there a couple of things point out. One, there's about a lag of 2 to 3 weeks in terms of how quickly soybeans canopy when they're deficient with potassium. And then secondly, the soybeans that were growing in deficient soils never even fully canopied. And so quick canopy closure really takes the pressure off any herbicide programs we use because they're stopping sunlight from getting to the soil and having new weeds germinate. So if we deal with soil fertility, it has a lot of benefits for weed management. So if we move on to our second point, we will always want to be in a position, and the majority of farmers appreciate this, that if we have the crop emerging before any weeds do, we put ourselves in a great position to start the year. And then if we keep them weed-free during the critical period, we're minimizing any losses from weed competition. So in corn, if we keep it weed-free from emergence until the 6 to 8 leaf stage, we've done our job. And then in soybeans, they're a little bit more competitive, but if we keep them weed-free from the 1st to 3rd trifoliate stage, we again have done our job in terms of minimizing impact. But there's a couple of species that really wreak havoc with that plan, and I want to touch on them now. And one is Glyphosate Resistant Canada fleabane. And so what I'm about to show you in the next 4 pictures is soybean fields in around a 30-kilometer radius over a 4-year period, just to give you an indication of how this species can spread over time. And so what's unique about Canada fleabane compared to other weeds is that when the seeds mature and falls off the plant, most of that seed will germinate right away. There's no dormancy. Most weeds have a level of dormancy. So if 10 seeds fall to the ground, maybe 2 germinate the next year, the rest germinate years down the road. So because of that, Canada fleabane populations can increase quite quickly. So often you'll see this in the first year, right? Maybe 1 or 2 plants in a field. And at this stage, that's not impacting yield. It's not impacting harvestability. So you're not really looking at tweaking your herbicide program or management to deal with this weed specifically. But again, because the seed, when it falls off that plant, isn't dormant, will germinate. By the second year, you can see a few more plants, right? And so even at this stage, now that we see more plants, in this particular field, it didn't affect yield. It still yielded very well. It didn't affect harvestability. So even in year 2 here, we see more plants, but it's tough to be motivated to make wholesale changes to a weed management program to deal with that. Then by the time we get to the 3rd year, though, now it's starting to become a little bit of an eyesore, right? And so again, in this particular field, it yielded well. It was relatively easy to harvest. Those fleabane there at harvest time didn't really impede harvesting. But now we're starting to get to a critical mass. And then when we get to year 4, this is what the field can look like. So now at this stage, we're definitely affecting yield and we're definitely affecting harvestability, and we can't ignore the problem anymore. We have to make tweaks to our management to deal with it. So we'll walk through that process. The second species that has me concerned provincially is water hemp. And so water hemp is from the pigweed family. So it looks very similar to red root pigweed, green pigweed. The main difference is the plant is completely hairless. The other main difference of water hemp versus our typical pigweed species that we see in the province, like red root pigweed, is that water hemp has male plants and female plants, and they cross-pollinate in order to reproduce. And because of that, they can adapt very quickly to selection pressures, such as herbicide use. And so we have populations in the province that are resistant to up to 4 different herbicide groups. So that makes controlling them with herbicides a challenge. And, from a glyphosate resistance standpoint, we now have 11 counties in the province that have glyphosate resistant water hemp, as far east as Northumberland County, as far north as Bruce County. And, the concern I have is, this is a pigweed plant, like many other pigweed plants, and they produce a lot of seed, and that seed stays on the plant at harvest, and seed moves around. So this is a picture of the bottom of my boot after walking a field a couple of years ago. I noticed some discomfort. I looked at the bottom of that boot. There's a bunch of weed seed in there. So I was curious to see what types of weed seeds were in there. And when I cleaned it all out, you can see here on your screen that the majority of it was from the pigweed family. Yeah, there was some crabgrass. Yes, there was some barnyard grass and lamb's quarters, but the majority of that seed was from the pigweed family. That could have been water hemp. It could have been green pigweed. It could have been Palmer amaranth. And even then, if we look at, a local grain elevator where we're dropping crop off at harvest time, around the unloading pit, you see a lot of chaff and debris. And I collected a bunch of chaff and debris up about a foot in diameter, took it to the university to see what was in there. And not only was there about 500,000 seeds in that little foot of material I collected up, the majority of the seed there was pigweed. And so I show you these pictures just to illustrate that seed from the pigweed family moves around quite freely through human intervention, through farm machinery, through trucks, even through flooding and livestock. So the seed can move around quite readily. And so because of that, you get fields like this. This is taken from 2019. It's a soybean field that has been sprayed twice with glyphosate, and the one species left to survive was water hemp. And this is a field that previously had no history of water hemp. So because the seed can move around, it can show up kind of unexpected. And so how do you manage that? Because at this stage, there was literally nothing that could be done to control those species, and it will have significant impact on yield. So are there things that we can do in the 2020 season that mitigate the risk of both Canada fleabane and water hemp? And I think the answer to that is yes. So let's look at herbicide use trends in the province that would help us manage those two species. And here's the good news. If we look at weed management in corn and soybeans, a lot of Ontario farmers really understand the benefit of early season weed control. So if we look at corn weed control in the province, the majority of farmers are using soil applied or pre-emergent herbicides because they recognize the significance of early season competition in corn. What's interesting about that 80% of corn acres receiving a pre-herbicide application is that the brands being used are also brands that are effective at controlling Canada fleabane. So you're seeing a lot of use of things like Acuron and Integrity. Because, again, this is a slide from work done by Dr. Peter Sikkema out of the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus, and you can see that Acuron on the right-hand side there, applied pre-emergent to the corn crop, does a very nice job of controlling Canada fleabane compared to the unsprayed control on the left. And this herbicide also happens to be very effective at controlling water hemp. So both options in corn, soil applied, that do well on Canada fleabane, Acuron and Integrity, also happen to do a good job on water hemp. So that's a plus, that the majority of the marketplace using soil applied herbicides and using soil applied herbicides that are good on both those species. In soybeans, it becomes a little bit more tricky. So again, if we look at this past year in terms of herbicide use trends, about 30% of soybean acres received a pre-herbicide application. And that's a bit different from even 4 years ago, where that number was almost around 0%. Typically in Ontario, the approach to weed management in soybeans, because they're not as sensitive to early competition as corn, is you'll do a vertical tillage pass, you'll plant soybeans and maybe do a one in-crop application of glyphosate. But in this past year, we've seen an increase in use of soil-applied herbicides. And I have the brands listed there below. So we're seeing an increase in use of herbicides with the active ingredient metribuzin. So things like Sencor. There's an increase in use of Aragon Liquid, Classic, Xtendimax, and Engenia. And Xtendimax and Engenia contain the active ingredient dicamba, and they're to be used only on Xtend soybeans. And there's a reason why those active ingredients are being used more so in soybeans prior to emergence of soybeans, and that's again to deal with glyphosate resistant Canada fleabane. So here again is a slide from Dr. Peter Sikkema's work on Xtend soybeans. And what we see here is a pre-plant application of the high rate of dicamba in either Engenia, FeXapan, or Xtendimax. You get very good control of glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane compared to the untreated control. So it makes sense why the market is starting to use more of that particular herbicide. If you're not growing Xtend beans, there's options there too, and that is to use a pre-plant treatment of Aragon plus Sencor at about 215 grams per acre plus merge. And that's one way that we can get good control of glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane. So in the case of soybeans, we're seeing an increase in pre-acres, mainly to deal with fleabane. Some of these active ingredients also have effectiveness on water hemp as well. When we look at post-emergent applications in soybeans, close to 60% of post applications get another mode of action. But most of us would recognize that a lot of that has to do with killing volunteer corn, right, which is a case of using Assure 2. Or if you're maybe trying to control nutsedge, you'd use Classic. But of the other brands being more prominent in the post-emergent window is, again, the dicamba products, Xtendimax, Engenia. And again, that's to deal with resistant weeds like Canada fleabane and water hemp. So we're seeing in the use patterns in Ontario a recognition of these weeds and management to address them. So we have we have gone through item number 1, item number 2. Now on our to-do list is we want to be in a position this coming season that if we do have to kill weeds that are emerged, that we do so when they're less than 10 centimeters tall. And there's a couple of things we can do to ensure that that's the case. And the first is going back to water hemp and the use of soil applied herbicides. So bear with me a little bit on this point. So this is a chart by two former grad students of Dr. Peter Sikkema's research program, Mike Schreiber and Brittany Hedges, and they evaluated the use of soil applied herbicides for the control of multiple resistant water hemp. And the key to managing water hemp is the incorporation of soil applied herbicides. And there are 6 products there that provided over 80% control of water hemp. So that's a good kind of foundation. I've highlighted with red squares, 3 of which contain the active ingredient metribuzin. And the significance of that is that metribuzin is helpful for the control of glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane when mixed with things like Aragon. And then those 3 herbicides listed there are also good at protecting against water hemp. So if we chose something like a Boundary or Sencor or Triactor in soybean, we can both deal with Canada fleabane, we can both deal with water hemp. Now, I imagine some people, if they've made it this far, go, well, good Lord, Mike, you're suggesting soil applied herbicide costs in soybeans that increase my per acre cost by well over $20 an acre. I don't even have water hemp that I know of. And if I have Canada fleabane, I don't have a whole lot. It doesn't seem to me worth it to invest that money in those soil applied herbicides, especially when if I don't get rain to activate them, they may not work. And so this would be my next point with soil applied herbicides is even if we get challenging conditions, limited moisture, they still provide some value in terms of early season competition. And more importantly, they keep weeds smaller, the ones that escape, than if we did nothing. And I want to illustrate that with this next example using the herbicide, actually Boundary Liquid. So this is a field shot from 2018. Boundary, or this was the soil applied herbicide applied here, little moisture for activation. We're looking at first trifoliate soybeans there, and we notice some lamb's quarters escape. So yes, we're in a position to spray here. And so you say, well, why did I even bother using that soil applied herbicide? I still had to go in and control those weeds. You did, but the weeds left over here after that escaped that application are all less than 3 centimeters tall, around 1 inch tall, much easier to control than if we did nothing, which is what the next slide shows here. So not only, here's where we didn't apply a soil applied herbicide, we had 4 times the amount of weeds, but more importantly, of those weeds, there was a huge range in their size. Some were super small, like, that inch tall, but there was a lot that were over 10 centimeters or 4 inches tall. And the significance of that is that they require basically twice the rate of glyphosate to get the same level of control. And in the past, when farmers have sent in herbicide-resistant weeds for testing, like lamb's quarters, the majority of time, it's not that they're herbicide resistant, it's that they were too large at the time of application to be effectively controlled. So the use of soil-applied herbicides in soybeans is something we're not necessarily used to, but they keep weeds smaller and they protect against water hemp, protect against glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane. The other thing that we can do to keep weeds small is to introduce some cover crops into our system. And that's where I'd ask you to consider this year testing out the use of cereal rye before soybeans. And so this is a picture from Warren Schneckenberger in Eastern Ontario, where he sowed about 50 pounds per acre of cereal rye. He's doing that with his high clearance sprayer that he's put a Noon spreader on. And so he's going in at about senescence of that corn crop, 50 pounds of cereal rye, and getting a pretty decent stand. What we've seen on the research level of the value of doing something like that is in the control of certain weeds. And this picture here illustrates the type of control we can get from cereal rye on Canada fleabane. So on the left-hand side, that's about 50 pounds of cereal rye seeded the previous November. And on the right-hand side is where we didn't sow the cereal rye. And so there we have significantly less Canada fleabane. And even if we do have some Canada fleabane, the closer it is to that cereal rye cover crop, the smaller it is, right? So it stays significantly shorter and more stunted. And the main reason for that is, and this is work done by Ted Van High, a graduate student at the University of Guelph. His research was funded by the Grain Farmers of Ontario in part, is that the cereal rye crop produces allelopathic chemicals, one of which is known as BOA, and that can have impact on certain weeds. And so in this next slide, this is some work that Ted did showing the allelopathic effects of the chemical exuded from rye. So these are 3 petri dishes with an agar medium. You can impregnate the agar medium with chemicals. So on the left-hand side, this is an example of lettuce growing up in an agar medium with no BOA. So on the left-hand side, you see their normal germination and growth of seedling lettuce plants. The middle petri dish has a small amount and 1 micromole of BOA impregnated into the agar medium, and you notice a reduction in root and shoot growth of that lettuce. And then when we get to higher rates of BOA, so this is again the chemical exuded from rye plants, you'll notice that there is very little seedling germination of lettuce. Of note, Canada fleabane responds the same to BOA as lettuce does. And so best case scenario, we minimize the amount of fleabane plants that even germinate in the soil with the presence of cereal rye. Worst case scenario is they stunt plants and keep them significantly shorter. And that's what Ted work has found, is that they keep the plants smaller, and it improves the consistency of control with herbicides, because smaller plants are much easier to kill. We can kill a small fleabane rosette fairly easily. When they get large, like this one here, we have a tough time controlling them, even with the most effective herbicide programs. You know, they don't get full and complete growth, as you see here. You see a little bit of green tissue, and then those plants tend to grow back within 2 to 3 weeks. So yeah, soil applied herbicides give us early season weed control, keep plants smaller. Looking at cereal rye, not on all your acres, but just on a few acres to get a comfort level around it. Over the course of this 3-year project funded by the Grain Farmers of Ontario, it showed to significantly reduce not only the density of Canada fleabane, but its size, making it easier to control with herbicides. And so you might say, well, that's fine, but I'm going to use Xtend soybeans. I can use dicamba. You know, size doesn't matter as much. Well, it matters just as much. So here's a shot of the high rate of dicamba and Xtend soys, and we get good control of Canada fleabane. But in that same field, we had very large plants, and you know, that was well over 15 centimeters tall. That plant survived, produced seed. If we had maybe had cereal rye in this field, we could have ensured that most of those plants were smaller at the time of application and done a better job of controlling them. So my final point, so that we wrap this webinar up, is you can do all these things correctly. You know, you're working towards good soil fertility levels so that you have a nice, healthy crop growing. You can have a plan to make sure your crop comes up in a weed-free environment and have control throughout the critical free period. And you could be introducing cover crops and focusing on soil-applied herbicides so that you're keeping any escaped weeds small so that they're easier to kill. You know, all those best laid plans are fine, but there's always going to be something that smacks you in the face, right? A species you've never seen before, you have no idea what it is, or a weed that isn't dying even though you use the right herbicide at the right time with the right rate. And so I just want to lastly end with a new diagnostic service that's available in the province to help quickly test for herbicide resistance and even plant identification so that you can make adjustments in the season. So it's a Guelph-based company founded by a molecular biologist at the University of Guelph. His name is Chris Grainer, and they're offering DNA-based herbicide resistance testing. So all you have to do is take a piece of the plant. So if it was a pigweed plant, you grab a leaf and send it into the lab, and they can process that sample in 2 to 3 business days. They offer over 12 different herbicide-resistant tests. They do some pest identification through molecular screening. And, Chris can be contacted at Harvest Genomics for more information on that. And so that'll be a nice tool to quickly identify any problem that we see in the field for the 2020 growing season. So lastly, I know I went fairly quickly over some herbicide trade names on Waterhemp, on fleabane. I just want to remind you that there is the Pest Manager app. It's a free app on iTunes and Google Play. You can select a number of different insects, diseases, weeds in different crops, and it narrows down the search to those that are effective at controlling whatever pests that you have identified. There, of course, is always other sources. We do a problem weeds chapter in our Guide to Weed Control, publication 75A for field crops. And that resource is available online as we speak in English and in French, and for purchase for the hard copy book. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and good luck for the upcoming season.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mike. That is all we have for today. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment on our YouTube channel, or feel free to tweet us, or you can tweet Mike if you'd like. We'll be happy to answer all of your questions as they come. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.